Hi, everyone. Today we are going to look at an argument for God's existence. This one comes from St. Anselm of Canterbury. And the argument is roughly 1,000 years old. And I'm going to what I'll do first is summarize the argument for you, give you a couple of objections as well. And then I'll tell you sort of the historical import of the argument. So let's begin here by looking at St. Anselm himself. He was part of the Benedictine order. He was a philosopher and a theologian, although during this time period, basically there's not much of a distinction between a philosopher and a theologian. So you are a theologian first and foremost, and then you use the tools of philosophy to argue for theological dogmas, right? So you use philosophical argumentation to try to prove God's existence, for example, right? So this is philosophy was in the service of theology, is a good way to put it. He is the person most associated with something called scholasticism. What that basically is exactly what I just described, right? Theology is at the forefront, and the tools of philosophy are used to defend theological points. The thing that he is most known for is the ontological argument. What this basically is an argument for God's existence that proceeds without any empirical considerations. In other words, just by thinking alone, through reason alone, Anselm would try to prove God's existence. And so there are some of his famous works. So we're looking at an argument, again, that's about 1,000 years old. So that's kind of cool. Okay, this argument only works the way it does because of Anselm's very peculiar definition of God. So Anselm defines God as something that which nothing greater can be conceived. So another way to think about this is the best conceivable thing. You just cannot think of anything better than this. That's what God is. So that's Anselm's definition of God. Notice that's a very particular and specific definition. We're going to see why when we look at this argument. But needless to say that the whole argument hinges on this definition. It's actually very important that we conceive of God exactly in this way. Okay, here is the big old argument, and let me go through it just once, kind of thinking it through it together. And then I'm going to break it up a little bit and go by each premise one by one. But let me just read from the top here. By the way, this is from Plantinga, so that he's a famous theologian that's around right now, contemporary philosopher. And this is his kind of fixing up of Anselm's argument. So all the basic roots are from Anselm, but he didn't write it in like a numbered form like this. So Plantinga kind of fixes it up for us so we can read it more easily. Okay, premise one: God exists in the mind, but not in reality. This is actually what an atheist would say, right? You have an idea of what God is, but he's not real. So this is an assumption for a reductio ad absurdum. What that means is what Anselm is going to do is assume the atheistic position. Then he's going to say, oh, this leads to a contradiction. That means the atheist is wrong. Oh, and by the way, what happens when the atheist is wrong? Well, that means God exists, right? So that is the route for establishing God's existence. Just think about when you have a friend who's clearly wrong and you want to show them that they're wrong. So what you do is you say, well, look, your position would lead to, this contradiction. Obviously, contradictions can't be true, so you must be wrong, right? So that's exactly what Anselm is trying to do here. Okay, premise two: existing in reality is greater than existing in the mind alone. This is kind of an obvious point, right? I mean, if you have something that's real, it's better than it just being in your head. So if you have a great idea for a business, it's going to be even better when you actually make it happen, right? So that's the intuition there. Okay, three: a being with all of God's properties plus existence in reality can be conceived. What this is basically saying something like, you can imagine something like God existing. Just think of something a lot like God, but not God, and think of it existing. Boom, there you go. That's a being with all of God's properties, but that actually exists. Four: a being with all God's properties plus existence in reality is greater than God. So clearly, if there's something that's just like God and actually exists, well, that would be better than God. So that leads us to 5. A being greater than God can be conceived. So we just thought of something that isn't God, that has all of God's properties and traits and all that and powers, and actually exists. That means that we just thought of something that is actually greater than God. But we know from the definition of God that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. So here's where premise 6 comes in. It is false that a being greater than God can be conceived. I mean, that is the definition of God, right? And if you agree to the definition at the start of this, then now you're in kind of a pickle. Okay, well, we can't come up with something that's it's basically an illegal move, given the definition of God, to conceive of something that is just like God but actually exists. So we have to refute that first premise. Hence, it is false that God exists in the understanding but not in reality. In other words, the atheist position that we have an idea of God, but that God isn't actually in existence, that idea is false. So let me just reiterate that in a different way. Hopefully it'll help you. What Anselm just did is to show that the atheistic position that we have an idea of God but that he doesn't exist, that must be false. How is it false? Well, we're going to get into that in a second. But it can't be the case that we have the idea of God and God does not exist. So this takes us to premise 8, which, by the way, is famously called the fool's premise. I kind of like that label for it. God exists in the understanding. Clearly, at least you have an idea of what God is. That's what Anselm is saying. Even the fool would say, yeah, I have an idea of what God is. Sure. Okay, well, because we already established that it can't be the case that God exists in the understanding but not in reality, the only option left for us is that God exists in the understanding and in reality. In other words, we have an idea of God and God actually exists. That is so not fun, friends, but let me try to give you kind of a broken down version of this. I'm going to go over the exact same argument again, but let me give you an example and maybe it'll help. I don't know, maybe not. You never know with me. So here is my take 2 of the ontological argument for God's existence. God exists in the mind, but not in reality. Okay, that's what the atheist would say. And Anselm's going to try to get a contradiction out of this. Existing in reality is greater than existing in the mind alone. So, for example, pick your favorite Marvel hero or bad guy, whatever. I'm going to pick Logan or Wolverine. So, Wolverine is obviously fiction, right? It's not true. But obviously, it would be awesome if it were true, right? So, if Wolverine were actually real, that would be greater than him just being an idea in a comic book writer's head, right? So, okay, that was premise 2. Premise 3, a being with all God's properties plus existence in reality can be conceived. In other words, you can think of Wolverine actually being real, something like Wolverine actually existing. By the way, let's just go ahead and imagine that right now. Let's pretend that Hugh Jackman actually is, has all the powers of Wolverine, right? Very cool, very cool. All right. Well, a being with all of God's properties plus existence in reality is greater than God. What is that in our analogy? Well, if Wolverine, the comic book character, let me restate that. If Hugh Jackman, the human, had all of the traits of Wolverine, the comic book character, but actually exists, which he does, Hugh Jackman is a real person, then Hugh Jackman is clearly way better than Wolverine because he has all of Wolverine's traits, but actually exists. And actually existing is pretty cool, right? On this way of looking at things. Okay. So we just thought of something that is greater than God, right? So we just thought of something that's greater than Wolverine, something that's just like Wolverine, but actually real. And so we come to the definition once more of God. It is false that a being greater than God can be conceived. In our analogy here, as I said earlier, this has to be the way that Anselm defines God. So if my argument is going to work, we kind of have to, redefine Wolverine. Wolverine is something than which nothing greater can be conceived. In other words, Wolverine is the dopest thing, right? If we define Wolverine that way, then when I say, well, you know what, Hugh Jackman, which has all the properties of Wolverine, but actually also existing, when we conceived of something better than Wolverine, we must have done something illegal, something wrong, because the very definition of Wolverine is that nothing greater than it can be conceived. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means the original assumption that we began with, premise one, must be false. It is false that God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. So it is false that, with our analogy, Wolverine is an idea in our head and not actually existing, though, like not a real thing. Okay, so Wolverine is definitely an idea in our head, and we're saying that it's false that it can't not exist. Well, what's left other than to say he's definitely an idea in our head, right? God exists in the understanding. There's definitely idea of God and of Wolverine in my head. And so because we proved premise one false, because we proved that it's false that God exists in the understanding but not in reality, our only option is to say something even the fool would agree to. God must exist in the understanding. Oh, and by the way, God must also exist in reality. Or with our Wolverine analogy, Wolverine exists in, the mind, but also in reality because he is that which nothing greater can be conceived, right? So that very definition, that specific definition, is what allows this argument to go through. Okay, it's not a lot of fun to go through that argument. That might be something that you want to watch a couple of times. Let me just kind of maybe put it in one more nutshell before I give you the objections. But, this is kind of minimizing the argument, but I think it kind of gets the message across a little bit. Anselm is basically trying to define God into existence, right? So if you define God in a particular way, it just doesn't make sense to say he doesn't exist. And so the problem, if someone wants to object to this line of, thinking, is that you have to find an issue with the definition of God that Anselm gives you. I mean, that's at least one way to object to this argument. Well, given that that's a little bit of that's my third summary of the same argument, let's now look at the objections. The objections, by the way, look a little bit like my explanations, but it's kind of just a different frame of mind if you want to think about it like that. But so I've already mentioned that this argument only works with this very specific definition of God. And if you were to try to define God in any more conventional, traditional way, for example, God is all powerful, God is all knowing, God is all loving. If you were to use those traits as, the definition of God, then the argument wouldn't work. It wouldn't even take off. Like it just wouldn't make any sense. So this is a very specific definition of God. It almost seems too convenient, There's something kind of funky about it, right? So why don't you use a more conventional definition of God? How come that won't work? So that's one objection. Another objection, which by the way is from a monk, right? I don't think he was Benedictine monk, but another monk, sometime after Anselm published his work, made an argument that's saying you can basically prove anything exists with this argument. All you have to do is define that thing that you want to prove that exists as, the same way that Anselm defined God, right? That thing that nothing greater can be conceived, right? So what the monk in question did was he proved the existence of some paradise island. That was, his idea. But the basic idea here is you can just substitute the word God with anything else in that definition, and you can prove it exists. So that's a little funny, right? Arguments shouldn't work like that so that you can prove anything exists. Because if you can prove anything exists, well, that is a useless argument. I mean, that means you can prove that a different God exists. And that is something than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? Or many gods, right? So there's something really off with this. By the way, when I was an undergraduate, I wrote a paper. That's me as an undergraduate, by the way. That got me really excited because I could prove Iron Man's existence. Clearly, I'm into Marvel, right? So I wrote this argument up. I defined Iron Man as a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Which, by the way, I think is true. I think Iron Man is the coolest, right? So, given that definition, here it is. I just took this same argument and just put in Iron Man wherever God appears. Did I get them all? There's one right there. Cool. And so now Iron Man exists in the understanding and in reality. Clearly, something funny is going on with this argument. Maybe not as good as you might have hoped. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say here, and I'll say them in a second. But at least in the West, this is the first ontological argument. In the Muslim empire, though, however, another philosopher named Ibn Sina, also sometimes referred to as Avicenna, came up with a very similar argument that is known as the proof of the truthful. Now, technically, Ibn Sina was a few decades before Anselm, so maybe he should get a little bit of credit. The only issue is that people disagree on whether this proof of the truthful is an ontological argument like that of Anselm or is some other kind of argument. It's a really interesting argument, and it kind of looks a little bit like the ontological argument, but it kind of doesn't. And so some people say, well, maybe Ibn Sina should get the credit for this. It's unclear, I suppose. This argument kind of rhymes with Anselm's argument, but it's not exactly it. Anyway, that's why Anselm gets typically most of the credit when it comes to coming up with an ontological argument. But I do want to give some credit to Ibn Sina for this is an interesting argument, and I cover it in my philosophy of religion class, this argument from Ibn Sina. So kind of some kudos there as well. Okay, I do want to give you, sort of my 2 cents here because I don't know. It seems like this argument is not so awesome. I mean, it's kind of a letdown, it seems like to me. And overall, I think it is one of the weakest attempts to establish God's existence. I am much more persuaded by some of the arguments of Thomas Aquinas, which we will cover, very briefly. Sorry, not very briefly, in a very short period of time, like basically right after this video. So I do think Aquinas' arguments are a little bit better. There are even other styles of arguments altogether that just seem more appealing. Basically, any ontological argument that I see, for example, Descartes also has one. It just doesn't seem that promising to me. Trying to define God into existence is not, it just doesn't seem, like the greatest route. And even other folks, right? Kant is one of them. Immanuel Kant, who is a German philosopher from the 1700s. He even says that maybe the most persuasive arguments are something like the argument from design. Those have a little more, meat to them. And so I just wanted to say that if you are not completely sold by the ontological argument, that's okay. Neither am I. A lot of people aren't. And if you love the ontological argument, I guess what I have to say is this: hold on a little bit. Like there's some other ones. Maybe you might like these other ones more. Right? So those are just kind of my 2 cents.